All right, hello everyone. I said that I was going to make a couple more videos, and this is going to be one of them. So in this, I'm going to read a post. It's a pretty brief post from an X account called Russians with Attitude. I started following these guys right after the war started, and they are Russian nationalists. They're from Russia, although one of them strangely resides in Europe. And It's not a long post. And there's a lot to be said about what they say that could be directed towards them. But then there's even more that can be said that they don't say directed towards libertarians. And so I think I'm going to talk about both a little bit, but I think this is interesting. It's pretty short. If I can find a link, I'll put it in, but I'm just going to read it verbatim because it's not that long. So this is Russian with Attitudes. They posted this on the 2-year anniversary of the war, which they still insist on calling a special military operation. So, okay. I'm just going to read it straight through and then maybe make some comments. So, it has been 2 years since the beginning of the special military operation in the Ukraine. Aside from intentional reflection, in terms of the rest of the world, the main thing we've learned is that they are scared. They are scared because after decades of languid attempts to join the world of cozy consumerist decay, we have started to formulate an idea. North Korea has parades with tanks and missiles just like the USSR did, or any other third-rate dictatorship. Such things do not scare them at all, but the idea that Russia is a country of and for Russians, and that it will protect Russians with absolute contempt for the illegitimate borders of 1991, and not just the borders, we finally found the courage to say that the entire post-1991 world order based on a monstrous humiliation and oppression of Russians must be reevaluated and will be reevaluated. And it is more than just words. These words are fortified by the hearts and arms of hundreds of thousands of Russian heroes. This prospect has them shaking with hysterical fear. We do not recognize your stupid communist borders. We will save our Russian brothers and sisters from under the yoke of international gangsters and murderous peasant idiots. This is an idea that cannot be refuted by McDonald's and Netflix, and it scares them because that's all they have. I often think about a video from the very beginning of the war, a Russian convoy driving along a road outside some town in whatever oblast, and some local guy walks up to one of the tanks and starts yelling at the soldiers, "Turn around, go home. We didn't come to your land. You came to our land. Go away." And one of the tank crew just looks at the guy and calmly says, "I'm on my land." The path may yet be long, and we have stumbled a lot, and we will continue to stumble a lot, but Russia is finally coming home, not just geographically, but spiritually, and we'll have to deal with the fact that a lot of people don't like this at all because they know exactly what they stole and when. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot to say. And because of how much he said about Russia's that I want to say, I think I'm going to talk about the thing that he didn't mention to libertarians. Notice one thing he doesn't say once in that. He doesn't mention NATO even once. Now, there's that you could say what does that even prove? It's just one person, it's one opinion. We know that the data on Russian opinion is very difficult. Obviously, it's not the most free place to express your ideas, but there's general consensus. I think even these guys would agree that there's a mix. You've got 15 to 20% on both extremes that, one side could be called ultra-nationalists. They really favor the war. They're gung-ho for the war. They wanted a war before it started, whether we're talking about 2022 or 2014. And then a roughly similar, maybe slightly smaller, maybe slightly larger on the opposite side that is maybe more pro-peace or more pro-Western or more liberal, whatever you wanted to say. And then a much bigger group in the center that's either apathetic or they're just going to go along with whatever it is, whatever they think is the most common thing. They'll just go along, get along. They're not super strong. I think even these guys would agree with that. And obviously these people, these guys who run this, it's more than one guy. I think it's 2 guys who run this. They don't have any control over the Russian states. They have even less control than a person in the West does, and people in the West have, I would say, approaching zero. So this isn't necessarily what Putin thinks, and Putin's opinion seems to be the most relevant when it comes to the decision making, because he's the one making most of the big decisions. There are other people, there are power structures, but he's the one who seems to have really made the decision to escalate the war in 2022. But what's interesting is he doesn't say NATO. He doesn't seem to be interested in NATO. He doesn't seem to be afraid of NATO. He doesn't say that we're doing this war because anything NATO did, or we're worried, or because of aggression or anything like that. There's obviously a lot of grievance that he has, and I'll analyze that in a little bit. There's a lot of nostalgia there. There's a lot of like virtue signaling about Russians and Russia, and not a lot of we're really worried about NATO and NATO provoked us. Now I say that because, and I'm not saying that as someone who's a defender of NATO. The United States does not need to be in NATO. The United States is very secure and very safe, and I am not at all sold on the idea that the United States needs to be involved, and if the United States is not involved in the world, that everything will be terrible. Yes, it's possible that the United States can solve certain problems. It's possible that the United States, given its great wealth and power and influence, can do things that other people can't do, other states can't do, but it can also do bad things that other states can't do, and other states reacting to U.S. power can also cause a lot of friction, and I don't know that there is actually a good way to on net calculate that and say, well, it would be more or less violence, more or less good, and of course what metric you decide to even use to try and measure that, kind of arbitrary. But I am very confident that the United States, given its wealth, given its strategic situation, given its technology, would be perfectly safe here. That does not mean it necessarily can't be abroad or should never be abroad. That's a different question, but it certainly could. I also am one of those people who believe that our involvement in World War I was a catastrophe and unnecessary, that our involvement in World War II, although harder to maybe a little bit more justifiable, was also a mistake. We did a lot of bad policy leading up to World War II. There was a lot of double dealing. There was a lot of bad statesmanship. Theodore Roosevelt was not an honest actor, although if we're comparing him against the other actors at the time, he's probably one of the least bad. I mean, if you're going to compare him to someone like Chiang or Stalin or Hitler, the only one that he's probably not worse than is Churchill. And then after the war, again, I don't think that we need NATO, and I think that there's obviously been a lot of costs imposed on American taxpayers for NATO, and it's also caused a lot of issues in Europe where they allow themselves to be disarmed. They allow themselves to not have to worry too much about their own security because they're getting subsidized by the United States. And there's an argument that maybe that's a good thing, and that if they had rearmed, there would have been World War III between Germany and France, or Germany and the UK, or the Eastern Bloc. And that can't be proven wrong. I mean, there's no way to know for sure at this point. But I'm just saying I'm not coming at this from the perspective of somebody who loves NATO and thinks we have to have NATO and thinks NATO's the best, and that I love the world order as it is, or as it has been in the last couple of decades, with the United States in the role that it has. I don't. The United States has made a lot of huge mistakes. It's a lot of owned goals. It's a lot of done horrible crimes. Our federal government and its high officials, whether they be presidents, whether they be secretaries of state, people in the Department of Defense, the various people in the congressional related halls of power that have power. There are people in Congress who have very little control over this, and there are people in Congress who have enormous control over this. When George Bush decided to invade Iraq in 2003, someone like Joe Biden, who is the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, he would have been in a position to basically stop that war, and he didn't. And so he's a war criminal, and Bush is a war criminal, and Cheney is a war criminal, and Obama is a war criminal, and Trump is a lesser but still war criminal, and Joe Biden is a war criminal many times over in many different capacities. So again, that's where I'm coming from. But what irritates me with a lot of libertarians is they then think, as Scott Horton says, that this war is because Russia was provoked. We don't really know that. It is quite clear from this mentality that, and if you listen to their podcasts, that they They just view this area as theirs. It belongs to them. They don't care. In fact, it's explicit in this. They do not care what the people there believe. There's no point in having an election, or whether it's fraudulent or not fraudulent. It's completely irrelevant from their perspective. They just consider all of this land theirs. In their case, it seems like they have a very, very strong nostalgic connection to the history. And they look at it like if Nova Russia was founded by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and because of treaty signed in 1649 between renegade Polish nobility and Cossack bands, that from that point on forever, that land just belongs to whatever the state is in Moscow forever, apparently. It's very interesting that where they draw the lines in history, what freeze frames become the ones that are normative and last forever. There are all these debates that I think are just silly about whether Ukrainian is or is not a language. Linguists can disagree, and you can get semantic about what you count or don't count, but it's irrelevant. If everyone in Ukraine spoke perfect, exactly, indistinguishably identical Russian to Moscow, that doesn't make the war okay or not okay. Just like whether the United States invading a country unilaterally, aggressively is okay or not okay based on how similar or dissimilar their languages were. The war in Iraq was a war crime. It was stupid and it was a war crime, and it would have been made better if just by chance the Iraqis spoke English and not Arabic. That is just not relevant. But it's relevant to their thinking because there's all this stuff about we're brother peoples, we're sister peoples, we're one people. They're little. Of course, they often treat Ukrainians as little Russians and holes, and they have all these derogatory names for them. But when they're not mad, they'll like to say that, oh, we're all one. And so without even debating that, it's just also has to be pointed out it has nothing to do with NATO. And it's also true that NATO has been greatly advantaged by this. NATO has expanded to include the rest of Scandinavia, Finland and Sweden, both militarily powerful countries. These guys in particular, when Finland went to NATO, one of them tweeted that, I guess what's the verb now, tweet, xed, whatever, that this doesn't matter at all. It just means that somewhere in a bunker in the Ural Mountains, some strategist puts one more thumbtack on a different part of the map. So the only thing that matters by Finland joining is that if there's a nuclear war, there's just going to be one missile sent to Helsinki, whereas before maybe it would not have been sent to Helsinki. Okay, and true, maybe not true, but then the attitude is that it's irrelevant. The NATO's involvement or lack of involvement is irrelevant. And so when I hear libertarians harping on this, and I understand you hate the federal government, I hate the federal government. The federal government is filled with war criminals, and they're stupid to boot. The things that they did, the war in Afghanistan, although ostensibly might have been justifiable, the fact that they made a deliberate attempt at the top to focus on the Taliban and not Al-Qaeda, that they let Osama bin Laden escape through Tora Bora, where at the same time they were pushing it on the Taliban. Whatever you want to say about the Taliban, the only reason that they had any beef with the United States was to the direct extent of their involvement with Al-Qaeda. All right, they're bad because of Al-Qaeda, so go after Al-Qaeda and not them. And the military, obviously many people in the U.S. military wanted to get Al-Qaeda worse than anyone has wanted to get anyone in the history of the United States, right? They probably wanted them more than people wanted the Japs after Pearl Harbor, or certainly more than after the Maine accidentally exploded in Havana. But they weren't really allowed to do that because the administration, and this is specifically Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush and Dick Cheney and probably others, wanted to focus on nation building in Iraq or in Afghanistan. They wanted to make Afghanistan into a Central Asian point of projection. And so they focused on the Taliban instead, and that's stupid. And that was a war crime. And the stuff in Iraq was probably many orders of magnitude worse, right? It was just a blatant war crime. And I understand hating the federal government for that reasons, and I understand wanting to blame them, and I understand blaming the CIA and thinking the CIA is criminal, because they are. And because they go and they overthrow all these governments and they do all these coups and they do all these dirty tricks. All true. All true. Abolish it, break it into 1,000 pieces, replace it with nothing. 100% agree. Even in many cases where they will get involved and they will taint something that might be good, but because of their involvement, now they now taint it with their influence, right? But that then does not mean that everywhere that they're involved, that they're bad, or whoever they associate with is bad and obviously in the wrong, and the other side is obviously in the good. This is something that is just kind of taken for granted. Before I had read any books about the Shah of Iran, I had the impression that Mohammad Mossadegh was the greatest guy ever, and that everyone in Iran loved him, and he was popular, and he was, the second coming of Christ in Iran, and that the CIA just plucked him away and imposed the Shah. And that is a ridiculously simplistic version of events. And they'll say, well, they brought in the Shah so he wouldn't nationalize the oil and he'd give all the oil money to BP. Only 10 years later, the Shah did nationalize the oil in Iran and make it into a nationalized asset, right? So yes, the CIA was involved. Yes, the CIA is criminal. Yes, the CIA shouldn't have done it. It was stupid. It was illegal. And the fact that there's a legitimate phone call where Victoria Nuland is saying that who she wants to pick as the mayor of Kyiv after the Maidan Revolution. Yes, she shouldn't have done that. She's a stupid bitch. The CIA is stupid. But guess what? The Maidan Revolution was largely genuine. Talk to anyone from Ukraine, and I've talked to lots of people from all over Ukraine, whether it's from the Donbass, whether it's from former Galicia, whether it's from Lemberg or Vinnytsia or Kyiv, or even you'll find people who are going to say they totally support the Maidan Revolution and they hate Russia and they've always hated Russia and blah, blah, blah. And it's not because the CIA duped them. Now, there's people in Ukraine who are pro-Russian and they speak Russian and identify as Russians. Those are also true. That also is a thing. But the idea that this is all because of NATO, I think is really, really absurd. And it's also annoying to me because I know where a lot of this is coming from, and I respect the hell out of Scott Horton. I've benefited so much from him, from the books that he's recommended, and I can understand on so many levels why he would have this take. But and I especially get the idea that look, the number one most important thing is that Russia and the United States don't get into a nuclear war, because that's the worst case scenario for everyone in the whole world. Totally agree. Totally understand. And therefore, anything that moves the needle in the direction of that happening must be avoided. And if there's anything we can do to move the needle in the other way, we should do that. And I agree to a point. But there does get to be a point where you are just going to have to say logically, if you take that to the logical conclusion, that nuclear blackmail must always be acceded to. A nuclear power must be allowed to do anything. Even if you are a nuclear power yourself, you can't risk a war with that nuclear power. And so you should just, if they make a demand, you don't want to irritate them. You don't want to make them mad. You don't want to make them want to escalate, even if it's many, many, many steps away from them committing suicide by launching strategic nukes. You don't want to take a step that way, so you just give up constantly. So I can understand the logic there, but I think practically speaking, unless you're going to say, well, we just defer and allow nuclear powers to dictate whatever they want, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing is I see so many libertarians then will just repeat what Scott Horton says, and I understand why. He's very smart. I love his books. Everyone should go read his books, Fool's Errand, and The War on Terror. The excellent books, excellent reporting. Watch his show, donate to his Libertarian Institute. I've read so many books that he's recommended. But you can see these people who are just repeating back his talking points because they don't have another source of information. They're getting it all from him, essentially. And that's a little bit disappointing. If you're going to have the opinion, do a little bit more research. The Russians don't care about NATO. It's a plausible explanation for this, by the way. It sounds plausible. We're going to it now, I guess. That's probably enough on libertarians, but let's go a little bit into now talking to the Russians. Now, I know these Russian guys don't know who I am, and they don't care who I am, and they're just going to say that you're a dumb American and you don't really understand this is a family affair. Ukrainians and Russians are like this, and it's not. But of course, these same people also thought that the war would be over in 3 days and that they'd be greeted as heroes, and they have a strong. They're motivated. Their reasoning is pretty motivated. So whenever they see Ukrainians protesting against a Russian occupation, like we saw many videos from, especially from Kherson early in the war, they just dismissed all of that as just a couple nationalists. And of course, when those same people came out and cheered when the Ukrainians appeared, oh, they're just, it doesn't matter, right? Like, it doesn't matter. And as it's clear in the comment here, they literally don't care about the opinion of the people. It's irrelevant to them. And now I don't believe in democracy. They apparently don't believe in democracy. And so I'm not going to sacrifice on the shibboleth of like, well, it's right if a poll or election says so. But I also do believe in like coercion and not coercion. And if you're coercing people, millions of them in this case, in many thousands of cases to the point of death, I mean, you have to have a really good reason for that. So let's kind of delve into those reasons. Okay, so let's scroll back up. I guess this is a little bit longer post than I thought. The main thing that we've learned is that we are scared. Well, some people are scared, some people are not scared, but I would argue that if somebody is scared, it's probably not because of any kind of moral rectitude that you've suddenly discovered that you didn't have before. It's probably because you have lots of nukes and have shown a definite willingness to invade and attack other countries that are no threat to you, and that you'll be self-righteous about it, that you'll think it's great. And that their opinions are completely irrelevant, right? So it wouldn't matter if they were able to demonstrate, and there's lots of problems with trying to demonstrate, quote, the will of the people. No one's going to agree with you more on that. But no matter any way that you tried to demonstrate it, if you could, it would be irrelevant to these guys. They don't care if you could prove every single person in Ukraine hates Russia and wants to be Ukrainian, which is not true, obviously, but like even if you could prove that, it would be completely irrelevant to them. They don't care about that at all. That's not something that's in their thinking. Okay, but you can see why people would be like if you're going to threaten to nuke them or threaten to invade them, that people will be scared. But that has nothing to do with you becoming rejuvenating or having a higher moral truth or anything like that. You know, I've seen homeless drug addicts threaten people with knives and guns. And those people were afraid of those people. And it wasn't because they thought, oh, this fucking heroin addict has so much moral virtue. How could I ever stand against the brilliance of his, you know? No, like he's just a crazy person with a gun or a knife who's trying to get some crack. But this goes into like, I think this is revealing about what does matter to these people though. So they're scared because after decades of languid attempts to join the world of cozy consumerist decay, we have started to formulate an idea. Well, I mean, given that most Russians are not ideological, and I think even they would agree with that, and among those who are, it's kind of split, given that for every Z patriot like this, there's also a Russian who fucking left the country and was like, I'm out of here, done. Who is we? Who is formulating this idea? Putin talks a lot, but he also doesn't say a lot. He's the one making the decisions, and it's not clear who, like, he cited certain philosophers, all of whom are dead, right? So they can't speak for themselves. He is politically oppressed all of his opponents, whether they be liberal or right wing. You know, Igor Strelkov, also known, or Igor Girkin, also known as Strelkov, is in prison. You know, he's a nationalist who was very much involved with the start of the war in 2014, very much involved, right? And he's in prison now, right? If you go too far nationalist, you could be offed. And there's lots of, I mean, we know that, you know, Prigozhin, for instance, I mean, people are all now saying that he killed Navalny, and let's assume that he did. He also killed Prigozhin, right? And many of the leaders of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, these breakaway republics, what a interesting mix of different, I mean, you had post-Soviet people, you had pan-Slavic people, you had neo-Slavic people, you just had like mercenaries, you had a lot of Russian influence. A lot of those leaders, you know, died in explosions in the last 6-7 years. And, you know, Ukraine has every reason to have done that, and maybe they did in some of those cases, but so does Russia. So like, who is this we who has this new formulated idea? What is this? One thing people do this with governments all over the place is they like to project what they wish and what they hope onto the state, even though they don't control the state. They're not telling the state what to do, what to think. This happens everywhere. I think we have an example of this here. They want Russia to be a certain way, and they're crossing their fingers and hoping that Putin is going to do that, even though he often doesn't do what they say. I mean, just before the war, like I think a day before the war, which contrary to their claims that Russia is the source of truth, they referred to as a special military operation. They made a video post, not a video, a podcast where they were lamenting the fact that they thought that the Russians weren't going to do anything, that it was all just talk. And you could see that they were crestfallen and upset, and because they thought at the end of the day Putin's going to back down. And then they were so proud when he decided to actually invade. But there's a little desperation that they have no control over what Putin does or does not do. They don't know what he's thinking. They don't know. And the stuff that he says isn't coherent enough or consistent enough or regular enough to reach conclusions. And even if it was, it would be up to him and not up to them. So, let's see. Cozy consumers decay. I don't even know what that means. So he talks about North Korea, blah, blah, blah. But the idea that Russia is a country of and for Russians, and that it will protect Russians with absolute contempt for the illegitimate borders of 1991. Okay, first of all, there's millions of people in Russia who are not Russians. The Buryats and the Tajiks and the Chechens and the Abkhazians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and all these other groups. And what does that mean to say that the country is for Russians? This is probably one of the reasons that they don't get too explicit with the nationalism, because it sells with a certain crowd. You do have these, I don't know, Slavic nationalists. There's some wiggle room here, because if they're saying the identity of Russia is not ethnic and not Slavic, but the Russian identity is like a civic identity that applies to everyone. But that's not how most people use it. That's not when people say he is or isn't Russian. They don't mean like, does he have a Russian passport? You have all these, I think, tens of millions of Muslims from all these different ethnic groups, and especially in Central Asia, out east, Mongolians, Koreans, right? So is the state for them or not for them? Now, the illegitimate borders of 1991. So this is a recurrent theme here. And he treats 1991 the way, say, Germans Hitler would have treated the Treaty of Versailles. But there was no war in 1991, all right? Like, the Soviet Union fell apart. It wasn't defeated in battle. It wasn't destroyed by the United States. It wasn't destroyed by Europe. It just died. It just died on its own. It couldn't exist anymore. It was a system that didn't work, that was oppressive and horrible for so many reasons, and these guys understand most of those reasons. These guys are not communists, all right, as it's clear in the thing, in their post and their many other posts. They will, but their view of the Soviet Union is very interesting, because on one hand they will decry it and blame it for everything, but then they'll want its legitimacy, they'll want its prestige, they'll want its station, they'll want its respect. The Soviet Union fell apart. It was not the United States did not attack the Soviet Union and dictate new borders. Okay, the United States at the time tried to prop up the Soviet Union. The Europeans were giving the Soviet Union billions of dollars, especially the Germans. The Germans were giving them tens of billions of marks to get them to leave East Germany. The Americans were giving them billions of dollars. Gorbachev was begging for hundreds of billions. And George Bush Sr. said, I have a budget. I can't give you hundreds of billions. I can give you billions. But he did go and give speeches in Kyiv, for instance, telling them, don't leave. Don't leave. You stay part of, don't be too hasty. Don't be too radical. Same thing, telling the Baltic republics that were begging, screaming, doing everything they could to leave. Right? Everything they could possibly do to leave. The American president was saying, don't leave. Don't be hasty. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't be radical. Right? These borders, the Soviet Union fell apart on its own. And when it was killed by Boris Yeltsin, who was a Russian nationalist. Boris Yeltsin eventually, after the coup in August of 91, just basically went to Gorbachev and said, "You're going to sign over everything that belongs to the Soviet Union. You're going to give it to Russia." Before that, he had met with the heads of some of the other major republics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and the four of them just said, Gorbachev did not want to end the Soviet Union. He believed in the Soviet Union and he was trying to reform it. Maybe he did a terrible job. Maybe he did a good job. Depends on your perspective there. I mean, if the point was to keep it together, obviously he failed. He was working towards a new union treaty. He wanted to reorganize it on a new footing, and that could have worked if these major republics, if Russia, if Ukraine, if Belarus, and probably those three, but also Kazakhstan, if they had gotten together and said, "Yeah, we'll agree to that," but they didn't. They were becoming much more nationalist. And they were so fed up with the Soviet Union that they just didn't care anymore. The one thing it had going for it was its ideology. It didn't give people better lives. It oppressed people. But it had this Marxist idea of communism, this idea of utopia that is totally wrong, but millions and millions of people believe in and find compelling. Even today, even stupid college kids now find communism to be a great idea and they believe in it and whatever. It's cute if it wasn't so horrible. But that idea was totally discredited by the 80s. I mean, actually well before that. And people were just tired of it. And so they're the ones who destroyed the Soviet Union, not the United States. There was no dictated peace. There was no surrender. That never happened. The Soviet Union just died on its own. It fell apart on its own. It broke apart on its own. And the way that it died, the only way that it died is because they did break apart. And so that's where those borders come, and it's interesting too, these part of the problem is the border of Ukraine and Russia was set by Lenin or by Khrushchev adding Crimea to Ukraine when it should be part of Russia and blah 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 communist this. Yeah, they're really selective. They want all the communist nukes. They want all the communist, all the USSR's tanks. That's most of their military is based on what was built in the Soviet Union. Their international prestige is based on the Soviet Union. So, for classic example, this the Security Council of the United Nations. It's got the main powers of the world: the United States, Great Britain, France, China, Russia. But of course, originally it wasn't Russia; it was the USSR. And of course, when the USSR falls apart, again, not because it was defeated in battle and some Carthaginian treaty of humiliation was foisted upon them, but just because it was a failed state that fell apart on its own, that was itself based on an empire, that was itself a failed state, right? I mean, the USSR is the worst state that ever existed, it and its children, like communist China. But the state that it replaced was awful also. The Tsarist regime was totally discredited. It had nearly collapsed multiple times, and it finally did in 1917. Okay, that system was an imperial system. That system was a terrible system. And there's nothing in Russia that is older than that or goes back before that. People can talk about all this history, but in terms of states, the Russian state is younger than I am. The Russian state and the Ukrainian state are exactly the same age. The stuff that was before then was totally discredited and completely failed. The Tsarist Empire completely failed. It lost all legitimacy, and it was destroyed. Mostly internally, but also externally. The Soviet Union, very similar. It destroyed itself. Yes, there was some external stuff, a war in Afghanistan. That did not destroy the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan, people who like him love to think that it was his military buildup. Not true at all. Okay, he didn't have to do that. It would have died anyway. Okay, so, but what they didn't want to do is humiliate Russia. So so even though Russia lost half its population, like something like 1.5 million, 2 million square miles of land, most of its wealth, its economy was destroyed. The Russian state and the Russian society in the early 90s and the mid 90s was a pathetic shadow of the USSR. but that was nobody's fault but their own. Nobody made that happen. It wasn't just, I mean, they were not only getting subsidized with money, they were getting subsidized with food. I mean, the United States was feeding the Soviet Union and Russia through Cargill, through all these other companies, right? But they didn't want them to be humiliated. And so they said, you know what, even though you're pathetic, you're 10th place in the world economy now, you've lost so much, you can still be on the Security Council. You still get all the things that the Soviet Union had. You know, we had a world order where the United States is the superpower and Soviet Union is the other superpower. And you know what? Now Russia is also the other superpower, even though that's obviously absurd. No offense to Chile, who has a greater GDP than Russia does. You know, yes, you have a huge stock of nuclear weapons. And so, you know, okay, you know, don't do something. But again, the crackhead with the gun, he's not a superpower. He's not a wonderful person. He doesn't have moral rectitude. He's not respected. He's feared because he's potentially very dangerous. All right. It's not just the borders. We finally found the courage to say that the entire post-1991 world, based on a monstrous humiliation and oppression of Russians, must be reevaluated and will be reevaluated. And it is more than just words. These words are fortified by the hearts and arms of hundreds of thousands of Russian heroes. Again, no Carthaginian peace, no dictated peace. It just fell apart. And what replaced it was Russian nationalism. And nobody tried to stop Russian nationalism. The President Clinton tried to help Boris Yeltsin get reelected against the communists. Go ahead, be great. You want to fight a war in Chechnya? Go ahead. We're not going to do anything about it. Go ahead. You want to suppress separatist movements in Tatarstan or Buryatia? Go ahead. None of our business. Come to the White House. Come to America. Come be in all the highest councils of the world, the G7, the G8, the G20. We're going to treat you just like you're the Soviet Union and what you're not anymore. It's like telling somebody who's retired and, you know, not even half their former self, but we're just going to coddle them and pretend like, no, you're still the number two. I mean, they were never number one. Obviously, they're always number two. Or maybe not even number two. But it is clear that he feels humiliated. You know, because Russia was a joke in the 90s. But whose fault is that? What is the USSR failed? Whose fault is that? And there's this idea that, like, well, the Soviet Union was imposed on Russia by who? Who imposed the Soviet Union on Russia? The Germans? Because they sent Lenin? I mean, come on. And you really shouldn't feel humiliated if you're this person who was not, you know, was born around then. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything to cause it or not cause it. You shouldn't feel anything like personal about it. Just like I'm not awesome and amazing because the United States won World War II or whatever. That's stupid. I understand people feel that way, but it's dumb. You should not feel that way. So, yes, you feel humiliated. And what? Now you're going to start a war and that's going to make you not humiliated now? Yeah, and you have, I mean, you can call them hundreds of thousands of heroes, but of course 1.2 million Russians fucking left. And most of the people in the Russian army now are conscripts. So they didn't like want to join or agree to. These guys, I mean, have had every opportunity to join the Russian heroes and they don't do it. Why don't they? I mean, they so much favor this war and it's so great and they don't want to be humiliated. But even in the points of their greatest, you know, drunken stupors, they won't bring themselves to do it. One of them doesn't even live in Russia. Why don't you go back and help the fatherland and help... right? So yeah, I'm sure there are brave Russians who volunteered. The volunteer army is mostly gone. It's a conscript army at this point. So I don't know how gung-ho they can really be about it. I mean, all of 2022, they were begging to get people to join and just nobody did. And they almost lost the entire war in the fall because they couldn't find enough people willing to join. And yes, people who are conscripted will go fight, but how motivated are they going to be for that? We do not recognize your stupid communist borders. Who made the borders? And who forced the borders on you? You know, this is not like the partition of Germany. I mean, the Germans don't even care about it anymore. This is not the separation of Alsace and Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War. This is not what's happening in Israel right now. Yes, the Israelis are partitioning and annexing land, and it pisses people off. It pisses the Palestinians off. They're stealing it. People live right there. That's not what happened. It wasn't done to them. The Soviet Union just failed and it fell apart. And the Soviet Union, I mean, who do they think is guilty of this? If you're going to assign guilt, which is dumb for any living person, but like, who did the Soviet Union? It wasn't like these other, I mean, they never say Jews, and I don't know that they're anti-Semitic, but it does kind of sound like, well, the Jews did it, or somebody hoisted the Soviet Union onto poor Russia that was defenseless and couldn't do anything about it. Well, okay. We do not recognize your stupid communist borders. We will save our Russian borders, brothers and sisters, from under the yoke of international gangsters and murderous peasant idiots. Okay, I don't know. This idea that cannot be refuted by McDonald's and Netflix, it scares them because that's all they have. Well, I don't know. If all quote unquote they had was Netflix and McDonald's, then they would have been in Kyiv in 3 days. But something is making it so that, and I was looking this up, since the war started, it's been 2 years. Okay, so in World War II, 2 years gets you from the end of the Battle of Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin. So 1,500 miles, the entire breadth of Ukraine. Now we're talking about 2 years, and we're going to take, I don't know, two towns a year, 2 small towns a year. Okay, but it's Netflix and McDonald's that's stopping them. Yeah, okay. And again, there's this idea, oh, the West or whatever is consumerist. Well, I mean, there's material plenty. Yes, that's true. Like, if you're going to measure it on, like, wealth, then yeah, Russia sucks compared to, I mean, not compared to sub-Saharan Africa or, you know, like Bangladesh or the poorest places in Latin America. It's certainly not as rich as some of the richer places in Latin America. But it can't compare to Europe. It can't compare to the United States or Australia or any of the Anglosphere or any of the Francosphere. But, you know, and of course the communists were materialists, and so that was their big, you know, we're going to make life materially better. And then it became clear they were full of shit and they couldn't deliver on that promise. And so what was the point? So here's this other idea that there's something more spiritual. There's a spiritual quality that's more important than the material. I'm like, oh, maybe that's true. I'm not going to say it's impossible. You know, there's more to life than men do not live by bread alone. I don't disagree with that. But how do you measure that? And if you start to think about it, there is no way that it's at all clear that this is more true in Russia than anywhere else. You know, people are spiritual in France. People are spiritual in the United States. If we're going off of like traditional religion, then Russia is way less spiritual than, say, the United States. It's maybe more spiritual than Norway, you know, some of these atheist countries. But like, the United States has way more evangelicals, way more Christians than Russia does. And if you were going to try and measure like how Christian they were, like, I don't know, how much do they go to church? How much do they tithe? How much does it affect their life? I mean, you see all these stories about these American missionaries like going and trying to preach to the Sentinelese and getting killed for it. You don't hear about Russian missionaries they're so spiritually enthralled that they go out and try and spread orthodoxy to all the poor Africans. I mean, maybe it happens and I don't know. I mean, I know that there are very religious people in Russia, and then they do maybe express it in a different way. But to say that they're more, there's really literally no evidence for it. I mean, the Soviet Union was an atheist state, and it ruled there for, you know, most of my grandmother's life, you know, 80 years, whatever, 75 years, whatever it was, 22 to 92. And that had an effect. And if you're going to talk about spirit and even like, the Orthodox funny, like, well, they're Orthodox, blah, blah, blah. But then when the Orthodox Church, when the Metropolitan of Constantinople, I mean, he's the Bishop of Constantinople, they don't have a Pope, whatever, but he's as high as an authority as you can have, when they grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian church, oh, well, he's just a Turkish nobody. He's just a Turkish citizen. Bartholomew's a total hack. You know, real religion comes from Kirill, the head of the Russian church, who is a KGB person, who's probably an atheist, who has, you know, $50,000 watches on his wrist. He's the real, true spiritual enlightenment. Yeah, come on, come on. It's risible. Okay, and if there's some other type, and this is the thing, again, a lot of Europeans, it's like anything you want to measure, like culture, whether it's literature, music, culinary, food, movies, any of this stuff, there isn't a measure where the West generally, and even specifically the United States, isn't like as good or better than everywhere else. I mean, granted, it's very difficult to quantify that, but I mean, you're the one making the claims that it's better in Russia, so how are you coming to that? Like, I get that if you are from a place and you love that place, everything else seems demonstrably inferior to that place, and therefore it just seems obvious to you. But, I mean, if you tried to actually be objective about it, this would obviously be stupid. Even if you weren't objective about it, would be stupid. But so, yeah, I often think about the video at the very beginning of the war, a Russian convoy driving along a road in some town or whatever oblast, and some local guy walks up to one of the tanks and starts yelling at the soldier, turn around, go home. You didn't come to your land. You came to our land. Go away. And one of the tank crew guys just looks at the guy and calmly says, I'm on my land. Well, you know, we actually have a lot of reports from Russian soldiers at the start of the war who didn't even know where they were or what was going on. They thought they were on exercises. They thought they were attacking NATO. They thought they were being attacked by NATO. They were in Belarus. They didn't know what they were doing. They weren't told what they were doing. And so now we're going to pretend that, no, actually, they were all Russian crusaders who were on a holy quest to liberate the fatherland from, you know, the clown Zelensky. And, you know, hey, Zelensky is, you call him a clown. He literally was a clown, and he is a crackhead, and blah, blah, blah. Not going to argue. I'm not going to pretend like he's fucking the Messiah. But it's very clear that a large number of people in Ukraine, almost certainly a majority, don't want you there. And there were a lot of people in the middle who are probably ambivalent who now hate you and will hate you forever because of doing this. Obviously. You're going to piss them. Like, I'm sure there were a lot of Iraqis and Afghanis who didn't give two shits about America until America invaded, and now they'll hate America forever because they killed their brother or whatever. And who can blame them? Who can blame them? And who can blame the Ukrainians now who are going to feel this way? So there's a lot of misconceptions. You know, things change. It's great. I love history. All my books are history books. I love reading history. It's super interesting. It's super important to, like, understand the world. And, like, why would you read a fiction story when you could read a real story about something that actually happened? Totally get that. I totally get that. Okay, but it is history, and things change. Every single day, things are different. You know, and when the USSR fell, and they hate the USSR, they, deride the communist borders this, deride the communist borders that. You know, I mean, yes, we still want the Security Council's seat. Yes, we want to have all the nukes. Yes, we want to have all the prestige that the Soviet Union had, even though we don't deserve it because we're nothing compared. Like, we're half what the Soviet Union was in every measurement, essentially, except in land area, and most of that land area is worthless Siberia. But we don't care. So when the Ukraine left, they had a vote, and again, I don't believe in democracy. I don't think that voting proves everything, but nobody has ever disputed that this vote was fake. Unlike these referendums they had in these new oblasts that were, like, obviously fake and stupid, and you couldn't have, like, every oblast in the Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union. Crimea was the most pro-Russian, and it was 54 or 55% go to Ukraine. Donetsk and Luhansk were next, and they were 85%, like 84, 85% leave to join Ukraine. Everywhere else, it was overwhelming. And you know who recognized those borders? You know, after that happened, the Soviet Union's gone. There is no Soviet Union. The sovereign state of Ukraine and the sovereign state of Russia and other sovereign states, you know, negotiated, and they agreed on those borders. It wasn't the Soviet Union, it was Russia that did that. Russia agreed to those borders. Russia agreed to fulfill those borders. So you can say, oh, the communist borders this, the USSR that, and Russia was oppressed, and yeah, I know. Communism was bad for everyone, but I mean, that was the country that you lived in. The Soviet Union couldn't have functioned if the Russians had thrown off the Soviet Union, and they never did. I mean, there was a civil war. Some of them tried, and they failed. But you know, and the people who tried to help the Russians resist the Soviet Union was the West. You know, are we going to get a thank you? I mean, you hate the Soviet Union so much, you hate communism so much, and rightfully so. Well, I mean, the UK and the US sent troops to Russia to try and help the whites. And maybe they should have done more, maybe not. I don't know. That's a hard one to tell. Can't say they didn't do anything, though. I mean, they did more than the whites did. The whites did nothing. They completely botched the whole thing. And, of course, part of the problem is that the whites were themselves totally discredited. You know, the Tsar had lost all legitimacy. Offered nothing to anyone. Couldn't even imagine how, and so he failed. And it's what's weird. And so there's a new history. The Russian Federation is young. It's younger than me. It's younger than the people making this. It's the same age as Ukraine. And talking about Peter the Great and Alexander, Tsar Alexander, Ivan, none of that gives any added legitimacy to anything that exists right now. None. Just the. Like, that is just history. The United States can't add to its legitimacy by talking about Magna Carta or talking about, you know, King Alfred the Great or talking about the Romans or the Greeks. They really try in the United States because they like to build everything to look like a Greek or a Roman temple, but it doesn't actually add any legitimacy. So Russia agreed to Ukraine leaving. Ukraine left. People who are in Ukraine apparently don't want you there. You admit this. I'm saying you. I'm sure they won't even see this. But, like, it's totally irrelevant to you. But what is the basis of the claim that it's, quote-unquote, your land? Because of the Khmelnytsky became a vassal of Tsar Peter? Or... right? Or because of what Catherine the Great did when she founded a city, like, okay. I mean, we could just as easily start talking about how Ukraine belongs to Greece or Mithridates or the Romans, or the Giray Tartars or the Turks. I mean, look, the Ottoman Empire has long influence in this area, and Turkey is still around. And unlike Russia, their population's going up. So, like, maybe they should have it. To rectify, to go back to try and get the lines to be the way you think that they should be because you just love the history. I mean, it's fine to think about, and if you even wanted to, like, lobby and, like, oh, maybe we can persuade them, fine, go persuade them. I mean, if it's so true that Ukrainian identity is totally linked to Russian identity and they don't have an independent identity, and Russian culture is so amazing and so incredible that all other cultures are just Netflix and McDonald's and totally worthless in comparison, then you should have no problem persuading people, especially such similar Slavs as the Ukrainians obviously are. Even they would admit that, that they should join you, but they don't. You don't have that appeal. You're wrong when you think that the only culture that matters or that has variance or pull is the Russian one. That's not true. I mean, it's not. Look, Chinese culture has an appeal. French culture has an appeal. Latin culture, like, all these cultures have some appeal because people choose to stick with them and choose to join them. Now, if we're going to measure which ones appeal the most, well, it would be the ones that draw the most people, and that's definitely not Russia. It's not Ukraine either. It's definitely the United States and the other Anglophile sphere countries without any question. It's not China. But there's now this monstrous war that's killed hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands. We don't really know. I don't know what to believe. The numbers are probably more than both sides admit. And so you can like get off on it because it's spurgy and and again, you're not even alleging like, oh, we need to do this or else we're doomed. The NATO will come and attack us. You don't care about NATO coming and attack you. So there's not even a plus. The reason the Libertarians go for that, because it's steel manning the Russian case to be like, this is the most plausible reason. Because it sounds plausible. It is plausible. That could be a real reason. But it doesn't appear to be like the motivation for these guys and Putin talks about this very similar things to this. He will also talk about NATO sometimes. Niet means niet. But really they're just humiliated. They feel humiliated. They want to have an empire. And the United States has done some things. The United States has always been, trying not to humiliate Russia. We'll give you your seat at the Security Council. We'll subsidize you. We'll train you. We'll let you do the thing. What they did do, though, is do the things that Russia wishes it could. Okay, so the United States, right after the Soviet Union fell, or as it was falling, invaded Iraq the first time, and said, "You can't stop us. No one can stop us. We can do what we want." And it was a horrible war crime. Should never have been done. But there were people in Russia who were like, fuck, we wish we could do that, and much more so in 2003. And it is interesting that when Russia invades Ukraine and they get sanctions and they get pilloried and they get lampooned and they get protested and laughed at, and they hate that. They hate that. But then the United States invades Iraq, and, there are differences and whatnot, but like, let's just say that all things being equal, the invasion of Iraq is just as bad as the invasion of Ukraine. And depending on how you look at it, I could totally buy that. I could totally see that as being true. I don't know how you actually would measure that, but like, yeah, let's just say that. What happened to the United States when they invaded Iraq? Nothing. No sanctions. There were some protests that amounted to nothing. Those were over in 6 months. None of the leaders suffered anything, which is a travesty. They're war criminals and they should be punished. It'll probably never happen, but that's the truth. But the fact that they had the power and the status and the prestige to just do it and walk away with it, you can just tell. And I've seen Russian diplomats, we are invading a country. Well, America invaded a country. Now can we want to do it too. Because they see themselves as they want to be the most powerful. They want to be, we're the center of Eurasia. And, well, who cares? Doesn't matter. We're the center of North America. Who cares? And, look, there's Americans. If, one thing that makes some Americans really uncomfortable about China is they think, oh, China's going to supersede us. And that's very unlikely because China, like Russia, is dying. But let's just say that it happened. Look, there was a time when the United States was not the number one country in the world, and it was fine. It was good to be an American in the 1840s if you weren't black. Right? Like, you don't have to be the most powerful country in the world to have a good life and to have a valuable country. They're talking about this moral rectitude and blah, 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 spiritual nothing. It's just envy to be the most powerful country in the world. And that's the United States. It's been the United States since the 1870s or 80s, probably. It doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. Eventually it will change, I'm sure. And if it did, it wouldn't be necessarily bad for the United States. I don't think me personally, it doesn't do anything for me. But there's a lot of people, when you're very nationalist, where it does matter to you. And I don't know, the Russians seem to think this is going to be their ticket to do it. I don't see how. They could take all of Ukraine. It wouldn't make them equal to the Soviet Union. Wouldn't make them equal to the United States. It wouldn't make them equal to China. It might move them from below Chile to, above Argentina. But that's about it. But it's not even clear that they can do that. And is this going to just last forever? And here's the thing, like the longer this goes, the more the odds that Russia falls apart again. And I know people think there's a weird idea that like Russia can't lose or can't fall apart. It's happened in my lifetime once. My grandmother is 103. It's happened in her lifetime twice. It happened in 1905 almost. This is the thing. Many Russian politicians, Russian leaders, whether they be the Tsar or the Soviets or Putin, who is not a Tsar, this is another thing. Like he has no dynasty, he has no family lineage. His children are not going to become czars. You're just going to have a power struggle whenever he leaves power, however that happens. Right, so trying to connect this to the Romanov dynasty just doesn't make any sense. He's not a Romanov. The Romanov dynasty is not coming back. Uh, uh, they're they're just not. Oh, so Russia has always wanted to be powerful, and then they get in these wars, and they usually do really bad when they fight wars against their Western neighbors. Okay, they do good. I mean, they do good fighting, tribes people, right? If they want to fight a war against the Chechens or the Uzbeks or the Chinese when they're still a feudal state, yeah, they can do pretty good. And fair is fair. The Americans also fought all kinds of wars against tribal people and actually got beaten several times, but ended up winning, obviously. But Russia also would get into these wars with more modern states and just get wrecked. Ivan the Terrible was in the Livonian War against Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and got wrecked. The Russians got in a war with Napoleon and got wrecked. Of course, eventually the war went against Napoleon, but it wasn't just Russia. They were every country, the Germans, the Austrians, and especially the British. And the Russians just played a part when everyone ganged up on Napoleon. But Napoleon got all the way to Moscow and burned it down. Right? He defeated the Russians repeatedly, just like he did everybody else. They fought a war against the UK and France in the Crimean War and got wrecked. They got smashed in that war. The one that they did okay in, and you'll never hear them shut up about, the Battle of Poltava, they defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War. Okay, great. You beat Charles X. You beat Sweden, which is like, even then, I mean, what, a second-rate, third-rate power? I mean, it wasn't France, wasn't Austro-Hungary, it wasn't Spain. Eventually, it was close, by the way. They almost lost that one. They got in a war with Japan, where they lost and were humiliated and almost had a revolution, and that was not that long ago. So I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm not predicting, but obviously can. Like this is just a country that can just fall apart. They get in these fights, and the only time they do really well is when they're in coalition, right? Yes, you can. I mean, and here's the other thing: Soviet Union this, communism that, 1991 borders this, but we beat Germany, we beat fascism, we beat. Okay, who is we? It wasn't the Russian Federation; it was the USSR. Who would? So on the one hand, woe is us, we were afflicted by communism, and then on the other hand, it's like, the best thing that ever happened in human history is that the Soviet Union, that Russia beat the Third Reich, and the fact that the Soviet Union supported the Third Reich and teamed up with the Third Reich to attack Poland and the Baltic states and Finland, and then got the body blow that the Soviet Union got. I mean, they'll say that they won the war. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to a country. The demographic hit, it was so intense that they're still feeling it now. It may literally have contributed more to the destruction of the Soviet Union than anything else, delayed as it was by creating that generational trough that just kept on giving and giving, and then giving them this mind virus that the best thing you can do is fight the Germans. The Germans are past it. Americans are past it, and the British fought the Germans way longer, including when the Soviets were helping the Germans. You know, when the RAF was doing a blitzkrieg in the UK in September in the fall of 1940, after the fall of France, guess where the fuel was coming from for all those planes, for all those Luftwaffe bombers? It was coming from Myopia. It was coming from Baku. It was coming from the Soviet Union. Trainload after trainload every single day until the very last minute. So it's like, well, Soviet Union, we hate it, but like, oh, we're gonna take, you know, we want all the credit. Russia defeated the Third Reich. Don't make me laugh. All right, but that's that. Yes, in coalition with greater powers like the UK or the US, yes, they can win a war against another great power. But when they don't have that, they fall apart. They fell apart in World War One. You had France on their side, they had the UK on their side. They still fell apart. And that wasn't communism. That was the Tsar. Or did he not have the moral authority? Of course he didn't. So like, there's a lot going on with these guys. Nice guys. Their podcast is interesting to listen to. But the idea that like, well, this is all because America and the CIA provoked Russia. I don't think so. Now, again, they don't have any control, but I think their attitudes are not unique to them. You know, to the extent that there are people in Russia who favor the war, the Z Patriots, who support what's going on. And again, even they would admit that's not everyone, not by a long shot. It's stuff like this. They don't, like, they're grappling with their own humiliation, their own sense of insecurity, their own inferiority, and they think that this is going to fix it. You know, it's that guy who's insecure about something, and so he picks a fight to show what a tough guy he is. And it just doesn't work when you don't win the fight. I mean, yes, have they had some successes? And yes, they have had some successes, but they're fighting a country a third their size, afflicted by many of the same problems that they're afflicted with. And they've also been humiliated, as they admit. They stumbled many times, and he admits that they'll stumble many more times. Okay? Who are we trying to impress here? So, anyway, this is becoming very rambling. I did want to talk about this. Now I have. Let me know what you guys think, and have a great day. Goodbye.